Well, I'm really delighted to be here, and I would very much like to thank our hosts today, IDE and JICA RI, for both arranging this opportunity and for fantastic hospitality shown to me. This is my first visit to Japan. I've been in Tokyo since the beginning of the week at the Future Earth Science Committee meetings. I co-chair that committee, and actually the issues we've been discussing over the last few days about the roles of science and knowledge in shaping transformations towards a more sustainable future are very much germane to what we'll be talking about this afternoon. And we've been at the Japanese Science Council for the last few days, working with the natural science community there. And I have kept saying, actually, there are other research communities who ought to be part of this discussion about science and sustainability. And I think many of those communities are represented here at institutes like IDE, JICA, RI, and indeed the kinds of partnerships I hope we might develop. So what I want to talk about this afternoon is first of all a little bit of background to how I suppose I as a researcher and some of my colleagues at IDS are thinking about the challenges we're now facing in a global world, the context in which the SDGs have emerged. I'll then talk about our new strategy at IDS and how we're hoping to help contribute research and knowledge to addressing those challenges. And then I will talk specifically about the way our work links to the SDGs. And then I'm very much looking forward to discussion with the rest of you. So I think the context that we're all living in today is one that's deeply globalized, it's deeply interconnected, and it's multipolar. So if we ever thought development was about northern developed countries giving aid to those in the south, and if we ever thought we could chop up our attention to look at what was going on in particular countries in isolation from the others, I think those days have well and truly gone. Just look at the last year and the last few years. We've seen climate change wreaking havoc in countries far removed from those that have caused it. We've seen food crises from changes in prices linking into causing conflict in places like Syria. We've seen the Ebola crisis in West Africa, where a virus not only wreaked havoc in those places and killed more than 11,000 people, but also caused panic around the world in a world of mobile information, microbes, and people. This is also a world where we're not only dealing with huge uncertainties of technologies, of people, of environments, but also a changed geopolitical order, where the old certainties of OECD countries who somehow were thought to have the knowledge and the technology and the finance to be able to support so-called developing countries are now being challenged. We're seeing the rise of China, of India, of Russia, the so-called BRICS. We're seeing other emerging economies taking their place on the world stage. And it's some of these that are having greater influence in the economic order, perhaps translating through into the political order. So, for instance, at COP21 in Paris in a couple of weeks' time, probably the pivotal effect on those international negotiations is going to be the kind of deal that China and the US strike together, which is then going to have impacts on what happens to the rest of the world around climate change going forward. So I think this is a very different context in which certainly we at IDS, and perhaps all of us, need to be thinking about development in ways that recognize global interconnections and challenges that still retain a focus on people in places, in localities across the world, living their lives and needing to be supported and to have freedom and agency. So to talk a bit more about the challenges, I think it's become pretty clear from what environmental scientists are telling us that business as usual in simply seeking economic growth and poverty reduction and so on won't do unless we also make sure that that growth is steering us within what some scientists are now calling planetary boundaries. And this is just one metaphor, if you like, for talking about the very big environmental limits and zones into which we move into greater turbulence and risk if we don't change some of what we're doing. So the planetary boundaries ideas were posed in 2009 by Earth system scientists, and a recent update suggests that climate change and the integrity of the biosphere, that's land and biodiversity, are really critical core boundaries, and they're really threatened. And we have to be really careful that development paths don't begin to tip us over into areas where we start to undo many of the positive things that have happened. And indeed, we're already seeing environmental shocks and stresses and increased pressures on water, on land, on air, having effects on people, on their health, on their quality of life. Not directly. I don't think environmental pressures ever act alone. They're always mediated by social, institutional, political processes which shape who gets access to what. Scarcities aren't directly the effects of environment. They're the effects of of how access and control are distributed. But nevertheless, those effects are now visible in many places around the world. So the challenge is, I think, to identify and begin to build true pathways of sustainable development, quality growth, sustainable growth. And one way of depicting that is to say it's not just about steering development within a safe space, within, as it were, some of those environmental ceilings, but also a just space. And this was a figure that Kate Rayworth in Oxford produced a few years ago, where she added a social foundation to that planetary boundaries diagram, referring to things like jobs, voice, resilience, income, health, gender equality, suggesting that the real challenge for quality growth and development was to stay in the middle of what she actually called a donut, using that fast food metaphor. We elaborated, colleagues and I in the STEPS Centre, in a paper that came out just after the Rio +20 conference, to suggest that within that safe and just space, there were multiple possible pathways. And if one thinks about pathways of development and change as depending on institutions, technologies, economy, finance, all interlocking to move societies at any scale along in certain directions, you could imagine some pathways that are going to take us right outside the environmental ceilings, fossil fuel energy paths, for instance. But equally, you can imagine others that are pretty unjust and are undermining human rights, things that we've seen in forms of governance that are very repressive, for instance. But in the middle, there are many potentially alternative, safe and just pathways, and that's what we need kind of conceptually to be looking for. But it's not straightforward, and beginning to do that is both going to require some pretty profound transformations in the ways we live at the moment and the way development happens. Transformations maybe in the structures of our economies, in the form that development takes, and in the meanings that apply to it, and the meanings we attach to our lives, what is a good life. And those sorts of transformations also always implicate power and politics at several different levels. We need often to be asking whose boundaries and whose safety. Something like a 2-degree limit for climate change, for instance, isn't set in nature. It's actually a political boundary, which is going to work for some people, but actually might be the wrong boundary for small island states that would flood climate change at a lower level than that. So we need to be asking quite political questions about whose boundaries and safety counts. We also need to ask where those pathways are going. Whose goals? Sustainability and resilience of what for whom? A fantastically rich landscape for some might not be the same for others. Politics also comes into questions about the ways that different pathways get chosen. The political decisions that are made about paths of economic change or social change. And finally, there are questions, distributional questions about who gains and who loses, trade-offs between different paths of development. And I'll come back to some of those in a minute. But I just really wanted to highlight right at the beginning that I think many of the challenges that we're dealing with are about finding pathways and thinking about the politics of them. So The Sustainable Development Goals, they were signed earlier this autumn. I think the challenges they set out are very much tied into with the COP21 meeting that will be happening in Paris. And together, many people are saying this is a great moment of optimism. This is about the world saying we want to reset development differently. We want a transformative agenda that can meet these linked challenges of environmental sustainability and human development. And indeed, the agenda is incredibly ambitious. Here we are, 17 goals, 169 targets that underpin them. But almost more important is that cutting across them is a different vision, I think. A vision for a transformative agenda that has within it some quite ambitious sort of views about the whole of humanity. And in this sense, it's very different from the Millennium Development Goals that the SDGs are replacing. If you recall, the MDGs were very much about an aid agenda directed to countries in the global south, developing countries. And it focused on a quite narrow set of mostly health and sometimes people-focused targets. Environment was there as goal number 7, but rather separate. And the MDGs were basically dreamt up in a small room in the UN by a small group of people who all met as it happened. The SDGs are very different. For a start, this has been the biggest consultation process that I think the world has ever seen. From Rio+20, moving through the work of the open groups, the consultations with civil society, all countries and groups have fed in to defining this new agenda. It looks not just at the symptoms, at the visible manifestations of health or gender problems and so on, but it seeks to tackle the underlying causes in goals around dealing with inequalities and governance and so on. It also integrates those more people-centred emphases of the MDGs with the planet-centred emphases of environment, climate, Rio+20. It aims to recognise these global shared challenges and not just to focus on what's happening nationally, but actually to reinvigorate international cooperation. So Goal 17 talks explicitly about global partnerships to address those challenges. And finally, the SDGs are universal. They're not just about so-called developing countries. They recognise this changed multipolar world and say these are universal goals that apply to everybody. So there we are in the UK now with our government having to say, right, how are we going to respond to the SDGs? Japan will be thinking, how is the Japanese government going to respond? And because of these differences, I think there are major opportunities here to shape really transformative pathways, locally, nationally, globally, to, as it were, set the world on a different course. But there are also risks. Some interpretations of the SDGs are saying, right, well, how can we implement them in the easiest possible way? Let's just pick off the particular goals that we can deal with. There's a risk that one will get particular ministries, kind of a rather siloed approach, a sort of pointillist approach to policy, picking out individual goals. And then there are those who are saying, well, there are just too many goals. We can't possibly implement all. Let's just pick out a few. There are major risks of implementation. Can actually countries really manage to implement this agenda? And potential failures of accountability. How are we going to make sure that nations and the world actually deliver? And I will come back to some of those, but I think this is a really pivotal moment where the SDGs could be fantastic, or they could be really disappointing. And I think there's a big role for research institutes in helping it to be the former. And that's partly the context in which we're trying to look at IDS. So how is IDS engaging? Well, first of all, I better just tell you a little bit about what IDS is for those who aren't familiar, but I'm very aware we have some alumni in the room and I'm delighted that you're all here. So IDS is a research institute. We're about 250 staff. We're based in a building on the University of Sussex campus in the UK. But that bit of IDS that's in England, I see as only really a tiny part of IDS. We also have 360 partners throughout the world. We have more than 3,000 alumni. And to me, IDS is that vast community, and that enables us to do what we do. And we do several things. So at one level, we're a centre of academic excellence, we like to think, in research, also in teaching and learning in our 7 master's programmes and our PhD programme. Very much linked with our research, so the two work in a kind of synergistic way. We're a community of development professionals. Everybody at IDS does what they do because they want to make a difference. So there's a kind of fluid boundary between research and practice. We also attempt to mobilise the knowledge that we produce with others for impact, to make a real difference, and we do that in partnership with others. On the University of Sussex campus, we're formally independent of the university. We're actually a charity constitutionally, but we collaborate very closely. The university ratifies our teaching programmes, and we have a lot of research links. And together, IDS and Sussex, I was really pleased, were ranked #1 in the world in the latest World University rankings for development studies as a kind of joint group. So those relationships are important. So there have been really 3 ways that I think we've been engaging with the SDGs, have gone to date. First is we had some involvement in shaping the agenda. Through the work we did at the Rio +20 conference, colleagues and I have been helping shape these ideas about transformation and sustainable development. Some of that's reflected in the outcome document. We produced a set of briefings which fed in various ways into the high-level panel which shaped the SDGs. Secondly, as I'll show in a moment, the strategy we've produced very much aligns with the transformative ambitions of the SDGs. Not that the SDGs came first and we followed it, but actually that there was a bit of a convergence in how IDS and partners were thinking and how the SDGs have emerged. So there's kind of strong synergy there. But then more practically, and what we're doing now, is to try to use our research and knowledge both to help to shape how implementation unfolds in a way that's sometimes a bit critical, as well as constructive, and to work to support implementation nationally and globally in various ways. So we've spent much of the last year working on developing with our partners and in a bottom-up way across the Institute a new strategy for the next 5-year period, which kind of more or less starts just as the SDGs have started. And there are some copies of the short version, I think, outside the room, so do have a look. It's called Engaged Excellence for Global Development. And I want to share with you first a little bit of what's in it. So it starts by recognising that complex, challenging context that I was talking about a few minutes ago, and suggests that in that context we need to reframe development from what was once a narrower focus on poverty to navigating much more complex, interconnected challenges. And the 3 we've picked out are focusing on inequality, unsustainability and insecurity. We also suggest a reframing from a kind of north-south aid move to recognising development as universal, progressive change for everyone everywhere. Development is as valid and important in Brighton as it is in Bogota, in Tokyo as much as it is in a capital city in an African country. We're also emphasising not just incremental change, but some of these more profound transformations in form and structure and meanings. And we're emphasising a move away from transfer of knowledge and technologies from rich countries to poor countries to mutual learning, to recognise that everyone has things to contribute, that there are innovations happening in all corners of the world and from citizens as much as from experts sitting in scientific institutions that we can all learn from. So a multi-way approach to innovation and learning. So this is the vision that we've laid out, a kind of big, ambitious vision that one often needs to kind of set the directions for one's strategy. And then we talk about our mission, which emphasises engaged excellence, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, the areas we work in, and the idea of mutual learning towards transformations, particularly around these 3 key challenges. So these are the 3 defining challenges we've picked out. I'm going to come back to how each of those relates to the SDGs in a moment. But I wanted first just to say something about engaged excellence, because I think this is what makes the IDS approach a little bit different, and it's what Sato Kan was, I think, beginning to talk about in introducing IDS. So we're in some ways a kind of hybrid between a university-type research organisation and a think tank. And in coming in as director, I thought we don't just want to be a hybrid, we need actually a term to define what it is that we do. And we've called it engaged excellence, and it's really an approach to both constructing and mobilising knowledge and our teaching and learning for development. It rests on the idea that the high quality of our work, its excellence, means and depends on it really involving the people who are at the heart of the change we want to see, and that's the engaged bit. So we've been talking about engaged excellence having 4 pillars. So the first one, the red one, is absolutely about doing and delivering really high quality research. Across disciplines, IDS has economists, anthropologists, political scientists, sociologists. We often work with natural scientists. We do a lot of interdisciplinary work. It uses mixed methods, but whatever it does, it has to be robust and high quality, producing really good evidence. But the second yellow pillar is about co-constructing knowledge. And much of our research isn't just done by academics, it actually involves other stakeholders in actually co-designing, co-producing and co-delivering that knowledge, whether that's with government agents, with civil society organisations, with activists, with local people in villages, actually doing that work together. And that helps to make it relevant, and it helps to make sure that it has impact, because those who might make use of it are actually involved from the very beginning. So that leads to the green pillar, which is about mobilising evidence for impact by involving stakeholders throughout the research process and using cutting-edge communications to make sure that it reaches the right people who can use it. And then the fourth pillar is about doing that in partnership. And what we suggest is that each of these pillars depends on the others. Pull one away and the whole building falls down, a bit like a Greek temple. You want to pull one away and the whole thing collapses, so each depends on the other. So I'm going to talk just a little bit more about this green pillar, the mobilising evidence for impact, because I think it's one of the areas that we actually kind of specialised in a bit at IDS. And just a few examples. So one way in which we do this is to take our long-term research and translate it into rapid response activities. We produce things called rapid response briefings, which take an emerging issue and actually gather together and synthesise research and evidence in a way that policymakers can use to tackle it. One example was the platform we set up last year to bring anthropological knowledge into the response to the Ebola crisis in West Africa, helping agencies to understand funeral practices, care practices, the local social institutions that they really had to engage with if they wanted to respond sensitively and therefore effectively. And it was taken up and actually shaped the way the British government and now the WHO got involved in the response. It actually changed what they were doing quite fundamentally. Another element of mobilising knowledge is understanding the context in which advice might be taken up in order to then inform really effective policy engagement plans. And this is just an example of a workshop that we did to help to build the capacity of South Asian think tanks to use methods, and there's a particular method we've used called the participatory impact pathways analysis to help understand how change happens and therefore think, okay, what are the right moments in which evidence might actually lever real change. A third way we mobilise knowledge is very much at the global level, over the slightly longer term, by trying to use evidence for advocacy and changing ways of thinking. So to do that, we often get involved in quite big international policy reports. We were involved in the World Social Science Report on sustainability, which helped influence the Sustainable Development Goals, and we're actually leading the next World Social Science Report, which will focus on inequality and injustice, coming out next year. We're part of Future Earth through my own role. We've been leading the Global Nutrition Report. This is 2014, and another one's just come out. My colleague Laila Mehta led the Global Commission on Food Security's report on water and food security last year, which is influencing government and international thinking. And we also led the UN Women's every 5-year report on women's role in economic development last year. These are just some examples. I think it's another level at which research and concepts can make a difference over a longer term. And then finally, we use technology, and particularly digital methods, to mobilise knowledge. Part of that is through making all our own work available online, openly, and running a number of knowledge services which collect up and synthesize and make available the work of many small and large institutions in developing countries so that they're then in a place where policymakers and others can access them. And some of that work feeds through into our IDS bulletin, which will be relaunching early next year in a fully open access way so everybody can use it. Finally, there's that other pillar of building enduring partnerships, which is both about doing good research, doing engaged excellence, but also ensuring that knowledge gets mobilised. So our partnerships are sometimes with research institutions, but they're also with activist organisations, with civil society, and with other policy institutions that have good links with their governments. And by building those partnerships in ways that are equal and respectful, we get engaged in what I call mutual learning and capacity building. It's not about us in IDS building the capacity of others, it's about us working together all to learn and build our own capacity together. So how is this engaged excellence approach relating directly to the SDGs? Well, I want to just talk briefly about that in 2 ways. The first is to look at how our own research foci map onto particular goals. And as I'll show in a minute, the 12 research clusters that we have in IDS, which are listed in the short strategy that you can pick up, map in different ways onto particular goals. And I think there are opportunities there to mobilise the research we do with our partners to help support implementation, whether it's in countries or whether it's around some of these global challenges. But almost more importantly is the way our work, I think, can help address some cross-cutting themes across all the SDGs. So I'll mention just briefly how our 3 big defining challenges relate to the goals, and then some ways that we're thinking about 3 I's, the challenges of implementation, of integration across goals, and of inclusion, particularly the idea that we need to include everybody and leave no one behind, which is a key SDG principle. And I'll finally just conclude by saying something about transformation and its politics. So, right, I've now got 3 slides, which are big tables, and I'm not going to talk them all through in detail, but these are really hints of things that one might follow on. So, what I did was to look at each of the goals and think, okay, how are our 12 clusters and some of our big cross-cutting programs, because we also host 7 or 8 big research centres which kind of relate to the clusters, how are they contributing to the goals? And what we found is that actually we've got something quite significant going on, which is relevant to pretty much every goal. So the first goal is about ending poverty. And actually ending poverty and combating poverty is relevant to pretty much all our clusters. But there's some particular work in our business and markets and the state cluster, for instance, a project around how we get businesses and market-based solutions to work for the extreme poor, project just supported by the Rockefeller Foundation that we started. Another key link here is the work of our Centre for Social Protection, which is focusing on schemes for cash transfers and social policies to support the very poorest and to help them graduate from social protection into jobs and livelihoods. So those are 2 key examples. Moving on to goal 2, this is all about ending hunger and about food security, and it also wraps in agriculture and sustainable agriculture. Now we've got a lot going on. We have a health and nutrition cluster with a big programme of work on nutrition. One is a big consortium called Transform Nutrition, which is working with governments and civil society to get chains of actors behind transforming policies so that everybody everywhere can enjoy better nutrition. But we've also been looking at the spontaneous mobilizations that one's seeing around the world as citizens begin to demand food rights, sometimes in quite unruly ways. And that's a project that sits within our Power and Popular Politics cluster. And then we have quite a lot of work on agriculture and agricultural policy processes, which sits within our Rural Futures cluster and our Future Agricultures Consortium, which has partners in 3 African countries and is looking at the politics of policy processes around land, around food, around gender, and around seas, trying to shape policies to work better for the poorest. Goal 3 is all about health. It's about health and in a slightly broader sense about well-being. And there's a strong mapping there to a lot of the things that are going on in our health and nutrition cluster, and also in the STEPS Centre, which is an ESRC-funded centre with a strong stream of health work. So thinking about some projects, it was this cluster that led our work around Ebola response. We've had a whole body of work on the zoonotic diseases, these diseases that emerge and that jump from animals to people, of which Ebola is one, but there are many others. And as we're seeing environmental changes and changes in livestock systems, there are increased risks of viruses that jump from animals to people. And tackling those involves understanding the kind of chains of interaction and the nature of those systems. We're also working on non-communicable diseases and the challenges of obesity and diabetes. Goal 4 is all about education. Education is not a focus directly, school education is not a focus at IDS. But we have had one of these knowledge services that we run, which has an education component, providing rapid response advice to decision makers. Moving on, Goal 5 is about gender. Now, we have at IDS a long-standing focus of work on gender and development. And these days it has been brought together in our gender and sexualities cluster. But there are also people who work on gender in our governance cluster and in our Power and Popular Politics cluster. And with a lot of different projects. Just 2 to highlight. One has been focusing on unpaid care. It's a really big challenge. The care work that women do in their households and communities, and the need to both recognise, redistribute and reward it if women are to be fully part of economies and for justice reasons. We're also working on men's roles in gender-sensitive development, and this project Emerge is working with activist organisations and men's organisations as well as those of women. Goal 6 is about water and sanitation. Where we've got researchers in our participation cluster and our resource politics cluster, working on sanitation, particularly Robert Chambers' work on community-led sanitation. But at the other end of the spectrum, a lot of work on water rights and the politics now around water grabs as water resources get captured by elites, often at the expense of local people's rights. Goal 7 is the energy goal. And this is a big focus of our Green Transformations cluster, which is working on low carbon energy and on how to tackle energy poverty, trying to get modern electricity services to the poorest people, projects in Africa and in Asia. Goal 8 is about really economic growth and inclusive growth and employment. And that's really the terrain of our Rural Futures cluster and its work on youth and employment, and the roles of agricultural employment, but also do young people want to work in agriculture, what are the alternatives for them? But also work that our business cluster is doing around employment in businesses and jobs for the poor. Moving to Goal 9, this is about industrialisation and innovation. And there we've really moved in on the innovation side. So a lot of work in the STEPS Centre about innovation pathways and the recognition of multiple innovations from the grassroots and citizens, as well as top-down forms of technological change and their roles in sustainable development. But we've also launched a new cluster on information and communication technologies and digital innovation, which has got some really nice projects. One is about digital governance and the opening up of citizen opportunities for voice through online fora, citizen engagement through the digital world. Goal 10 is our inequality goal, which all clusters are working towards, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute because it's one of our big defining challenges. Goal 11 is about cities and urbanisation. And over the last year, we had already decided that urban contexts were increasingly important to development. Growing proportions of the world's population, and especially the poor, and some of the biggest challenges around environment, around conflict, around poverty are happening in cities. So we brought some of this together and had a new cities cluster with some really interesting projects. One is about informal work in urban settings in South Asia. Another is about the role of policing in urban settings and creating security for people. And finally, because these goals go on, there are a lot, we're working around Goal 12, particularly in areas around trade, but also this is about sustainable production and consumption, where we've focused in on waste and ideas about the circular economy in our green transformations work. Climate change, Goal 13, is the focus of our green transformations cluster and our resource politics work. One key project there is looking at the drivers of low carbon investment. We're comparing what's happening in China and in India, looking at how state and business actors link. I might take 10 actually, if that's all right. Land, which is Goal 15, we've got several projects on the commercialisation of land and the issues emerging around land grabbing, particularly in Africa, and also around carbon. Goal 16 is the really exciting and broad one around accountable institutions and peace. And this is again one of our key defining challenges, but just to mention here that several of our clusters are working in this area. And finally, Goal 17 is all about implementation and partnerships. And again, this is a cross-cutting theme that we're working on. So I'm going to just now take a few minutes to look at those cross-cuts. So we've picked out these three defining challenges, and each of them relates to several. So reducing inequalities is the focus of Goal 10, but it's also relevant to several of the others. Goal 1 on poverty, Goal 16, Goal 5 on gender. And our work at IDS across all these clusters is not just looking at economic inequalities, it's looking at multiple dimensions and the ways they intersect. Political inequality with voice and power, social and gender inequalities, and what we call knowledge inequalities. Whose voices and knowledge get to count and whose is excluded. So our work is partly about understanding the mechanisms through which inequalities are produced and arise and intersect. But it's also about thinking about transformative policies that might help redress inequality, whether those are in the economic area. We've got a lot of work on tax, on employment and financial regulation, but others that are around forms of economic organising, where people are demanding justice from below. And all of this is quite political. So policies aren't implemented in a vacuum. We're looking at how political leadership and party politics can begin to offer leadership for inequality-reducing policies, but also at how people themselves are demanding change from the bottom up. Our second defining challenge is accelerating sustainability. Now, several of the goals, as we've seen, have environment at their core. The goals on climate change, on water, on land, on agriculture. But indirectly all of them, because this is an agenda about the planet as well as people. And we find that all of these environmental challenges are interlinked. You can't actually look at one on its own. And they affect people across the world, often global effects having local impacts, requiring quite urgently needed transformations, as I suggested earlier. So our work here is focusing both on identifying and understanding these diverse possible pathways, but also on the political and economic processes that can either open them up and drive them. How, for instance, do you get sustainable energy? What combinations of business and markets and states and social movements are going to bring them about? But also, what power relations need to be overcome? How can we push the incumbent pathways away? And innovation is really critical. And we're finding that sometimes pathways might be technology-led, sometimes they might be market-led or state-led or citizen-led, but very often they involve alliances of those groups and those. Our third defining challenge, which we've called Building Inclusive and Secure Societies, relates very directly to that goal 16 about peace and governance, but it's also relevant to many of the others, those around inequality and so on. And we recognise here the risks and uncertainties from conflict and violence that affect people, but also other kinds of shocks. Shocks in health, like the Ebola crisis, shocks in environment and economy. And our work here is attempting to move beyond top-down ideas about security to try and build security from below, recognising people's own diverse experiences and perceptions of insecurity and being unsafe, and trying to identify what we would call institutions for inclusive security that can build trust between citizens and other agencies and actually rebuild the kinds of social contexts that enable people to be resilient for the future. So if I can take just a couple more minutes, I mentioned earlier that as well as these defining challenge crosscuts, we think three other cross-cutting issues are also really important for the SDGs, and they all begin with I. So one of them is implementation. Now all countries are going to need to implement goals. And what our work is suggesting is that this mustn't happen just on a goal-by-goal basis. What's going to be really critical is that countries in the world keep these core cross-cutting values center stage, these 5 Ps that are there in the outcome document. And a lot of attention needs to go to these cross-cutting capacities around technologies and innovation and data and statistics, which are recognised in Goal 17, but actually are important to all of them. There are big challenges at the moment which we're engaging with around developing indicators, which both have to address a lot of different targets and goals at the national level, but we think must be done in a way that's transparent and inclusive, and maybe isn't just about numbers, but perhaps we also need some participatory indicators which capture people's stories of change. At the same time, there's a move globally to develop a set of essential indicators which all countries will collect, which can be aggregated up and look at how the world is doing in moving towards sustainable development. And I think there's lots of work to be done to ensure that countries in the world remain accountable to delivering on those things. And there are big questions about that at the moment. There's a high-level political forum which has been set up to attempt to govern implementation, but it doesn't really have teeth. It's in effect voluntary. So I think a lot of governance work needs to go on around how we make sure that these goals are adhered to. The second I is about integration across the goals. Now, I've talked about that a little bit in the context of equality, sustainability, security. All of those work across several goals. But there are also interactions between them. So at IDS, as well as working around each of those challenges, we're also interested in the ways that those interlace, so that we can avoid perhaps difficult trade-offs between them. Take something like Goal 5 around gender and women's empowerment, and Goal 3, I think it is, around sustainable agriculture. You could envisage some pretty difficult trade-offs if you pursue sustainable agriculture in a way that doesn't recognise women's roles as food producers and actually ends up undermining their rights to land and labour. On the other hand, you could build some really fantastic synergies between women's empowerment and something like environmental sustainability and climate change. If you look to recognise, identify, support, build on some of the existing community-based adaptation approaches in which women are playing key leadership roles. So I think there's masses of work to be done, almost pairing up any of those goals or looking at the synergies between them. The third I is inclusion, and it's captured by this principle in the SDG outcome document about leave no one behind. Now, this was a principle that came out of, was articulated by the high-level panel that basically wrote the SDG document and advised the UN. And the adoption of that principle actually came quite directly from IDS work, and it's something we're quite proud of. we had a project that was going on just in the SDG preparation process called Work With Us, which took 83 participatory development projects in different parts of the world and did action research with people to identify what their priorities would be, and work with the very poorest and the most marginalised. And taking their perspective seriously was very much taken up by the high-level panel in this principle. And what emerged again from the priorities of the poorest and most marginalised wasn't individual goals. It was across them. It was at integration challenges. What people said was, okay, we've got health services, agricultural services. The point is we don't get access to them. And that cross-cutting issue about reaching the most marginalised depends on things like social norms, access, governance in particular contexts. So that is the message, I think, of Leave No One Behind. We have to find ways of reaching the most marginalised. So finally, and I am going to stop, this is my last slide. If we're going to think about transformation and really making the most of this SDG agenda, we also have to think about the political processes and the wider politics of a transformative agenda. Now that involves the politics nationally and globally of ensuring and putting pressure on making sure that the right choices are made by governments and by international agencies. And that's going to involve not just top-down leadership, but also pressure from below and new kinds of partnerships between state, civil society and businesses. And I think that focusing in on how those politics are going to work is a big priority. There's also a politics, a global politics around universalism actually, around getting rich countries as well as poor countries to take these goals seriously. There's a new politics of multilateralism opening up, and I think as part of the SDGs, there's work that needs to be done about strengthening the international agencies that can hold governments accountable. Finally, there's an opportunity to, as it were, use this SDG moment to open up political space to put these transformative agendas out there at a time when countries are tending otherwise to close down around recession, around their own economic problems. And I think there's a role there for public campaigns to say, actually, this is a time when we need to think globally and think about these big challenges in really open, forward-looking ways. So supporting that kind of advocacy, I think is a key role. And it's a key role for research institutes, a key role for providing research and knowledge and engaging it with those in a position to act. So that's the kind of work I see IDS doing and trying to do over the next 5 years in our new strategy. And I would really like to explore ways that we could do it in partnership with some of the institutions here in Japan.